Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd and this is my review of episode 7 of season 2 of Star Trek Picard called Monsters. And the previous episode ended on the line, how much worse can it possibly get? And this episode answers that question. I think this episode is the worst thing I ever saw, not just in Star Trek, but one of the worst things I ever saw, period. And the sad thing is that the potential of the overall idea is not that bad. There are plenty of TV shows and movies that use this idea of going into someone's mind to kind of psychoanalyze them, and usually they do it with some artistic stuff, with symbolism, with all kinds of crazy, even fantasy stuff. Even in Star Trek Discovery, they had that whole story with that kid who caused the burn because his mom died when he was a kid, and he lived his whole life inside the holodeck in a kind of fantasy land until the Discovery crew arrived and tried to figure him out. And so even that was kind of similar, but at least in that episode it was visually good. At least it was artistic and with eye candy and all of that, so it was semi-entertaining. And yet in this show, in Star Trek Picard, it's so lazy and cheap that they're not even showing anything interesting visually. And so what's even the point to do a story like that if you're not even going to show anything cool or pretty or anything? The only thing remotely like that was that painting on the window that started to move a little bit. So that was like 5 seconds of something interesting visually, and that was basically it. The rest of it was running through dark corridors and just talking for the whole episode. So what a wasted opportunity, what a pathetic, lame attempt of this kind of story. And this is the kind of story that almost every science fiction show did at some point. There was always an episode when someone has to go into someone else's mind, into their subconscious, to figure something out, and it's always an opportunity to do a lot of crazy stuff because it's all a dream basically, so you can do anything you want inside that dream. So this is the perfect opportunity to do whatever crazy special effect you want to make up, and yet this episode barely did any of it, only those paintings on the window, and there was that part with monsters showing up, and it was basically Freddy Krueger and the clown from It, which you couldn't see its face for some reason. The face was blurred, so that kind of implied some mystery that you're going to find out later who it was, but you never do, so it was pointless. And the other was a Freddy Krueger kind of monster, and then they just disappear and it was all pointless. So that was the only remotely interesting thing visually in the whole episode. The rest of it was just talking. And the funniest part is that the things inside the dream actually make more sense than whatever is going on outside in the reality of the show, outside of the dream. And let me explain what's happening. So they took Picard, who was hit by a car driven by Sung, who was influenced by Q, because he wanted to stop Picard's ancestor from going into space, and so he drove over Picard, who is a robot, but he's bleeding, and instead of taking them to their ship with the biobed, they take it to the clinic of that doctor who got raided because she treated illegal aliens. And Rios escaped from the police just a few episodes ago, so you would think they would be looking for him, and so it never occurs to anyone the police would return to the place where he was arrested. So they bring Picard into the same clinic where he was arrested because I guess they think that doctor of the 21st century will know more how to treat him than they do. And then he falls into a coma, and Nat Laris is going to use her magical device to get into his mind to figure out what's going on and why he's not waking up. And the doctor lady used a defibrillator on him, which burned out because it's positronic or something, and then she said, okay, I give up, and she just left them there and went home. And now Nat Laris wants to use her mind device to go into Picard's mind to figure out what's bothering him so that he will wake up. Because for the whole season, Picard has been having those flashbacks of his mother being beaten up by his father. And in my previous review I asked the question, was he having those flashbacks his entire life since his childhood? And so someone in my comment section actually suggested a clever idea to explain it by saying that maybe ever since his mind was transferred into a synthetic body, maybe his memory got better, and maybe that allowed that memory to resurface, a memory which he didn't remember previously but now he does because he's now in a positronic synthetic body. So that could have been clever if the show actually bothered to explain that, but we're meant to believe, according to the show, that he never overcame that tragedy of his childhood and he keeps having those flashbacks his entire life, and so now those flashbacks are keeping him from waking up, and so Nat Laris has to go into his mind with her magic device, which we saw earlier she can possess people at will, and yet when they were at that party she couldn't use it for some reason, and now she can use it. And why didn't she use it on Renee? Because Renee was also troubled. and almost didn't go on her super important mission because of some psycho meddling that you did to her. And so how come Nat Laris didn't use this device on Renee to try to fix her? And so suddenly she is able to do that to Picard, and so she wears something that looks like Romulan ears, even though she previously said she's not Romulan, and now she goes into Picard's mind. And then we have that kind of story that every science fiction show does at some point, of going into someone's mind. And this especially reminds me of the movie called The Cell, in which also a woman has to go into someone's mind to figure out some information he was hiding or something, and then she sees all kinds of crazy stuff in there. But at least that movie was very artistic. It had a lot of neat special effects and costumes and all kinds of crazy stuff, which made it interesting. And even Smallville kind of ripped off that movie when they had an episode when Clark Kent had to go into Lex Luthor's mind when he was in a coma, and then he saw his childhood and how he was abused by his father and all kinds of crazy stuff. And so we have something similar in this episode of Picard, but here it's all lame with barely any special effects at all, and very unoriginal on top of that. And if you are going to rip something off, at least do your own spin on it, at least add something to it, do something differently, or at least do it well. But it's none of these things, and so it's totally unoriginal. So anyway, Nat Laris goes into his mind, and then she sees the little Picard playing with his mother. And we even see that she's peeking at him through something, and it's exactly like in that movie The Cell, when the lady who went into the guy's mind was kind of peeking into it through a closet or something to see how he was abused by his father. And so the idea is very similar, but it's done a million times worse in this episode. And speaking of unoriginality, remember when I complained about those scenes with Jurati in the red dress talking with an imaginary friend that no one else can see? Really reminds me of Battlestar Galactica. And in this episode we have the same exact guy who was seeing the imaginary woman in the red dress in Battlestar Galactica. Now he's in this episode playing like a psychiatrist or something, talking with Picard. And I keep wondering, what is Picard thinking that is happening in this moment? Because Picard at this point doesn't seem to be aware he's inside his own mind or something. So he's thinking he's undergoing some psych evaluation by a guy who's wearing a Deep Space Nine era uniform, and Picard himself is still wearing his costume from the party. And which ship this is on exactly, nothing is clear, nothing makes any sense. He later said that this was in his ready room, but it doesn't look like the Enterprise E, so which ship exactly is this on? And the dialogue doesn't make any sense. Most of it seems kind of nonsensical, as if they had no script, as if they were improvising all of their lines, and Picard himself is acting very obnoxious in all of these scenes. Like, he doesn't want to be here, he doesn't want to talk with this guy, he's been very uncooperative and all of that, which kind of makes sense if that guy is trying to dig into his past and all of that, but we're not even at that point yet. He's just having a casual conversation with him, and yet Picard keeps insulting him and doesn't want to answer anything. And also that guy talks about the sun and says the sun gives life, and yet it will swallow us all in the future, which makes no sense in the context of Star Trek, in which they have colonies in other solar systems and they can always move to another solar system. So that line doesn't even make any sense in this context. And then Picard says that he's claustrophobic, that the reason he went out into space was to be in the open space because it's less claustrophobic for him than to be on Earth, I guess, which makes no sense. To be closed inside a closed ship in small rooms somehow makes it less claustrophobic than being in the open air in the vineyard. So none of this makes any sense. As this is the sentence I repeated probably a million times watching the show. Nothing makes any sense. It's all in reverse. Everything is upside down to how it would make sense. And especially in the real world, outside of the dream, it makes even less sense, because Picard is still lying in that clinic. So the doctor cured him by giving him an electric shock in the previous episode, then she went away. But for some reason they don't beam him into their ship, which has a biobed and scanners and advanced equipment and holograms and everything they would need. And they do have the transporters in this episode. They do have powers for them, because we see people and objects being beamed back and forth from the ship to the clinic and to other places in LA, so they do have the transporters. So why don't they take Picard back to his own ship? Instead they leave him in the clinic while Nat Laris hacks into his brain with her not Romulan device, which looks like a Romulan ear device, and they just do it in the clinic, which was just raided by police just 2 days ago. And Rios is on the run from the police, but they're not worried about any of that. And then the doctor comes back, and Rios locked the door so that she wouldn't see what's going on. And then she gets angry, and then he opens the door, and then she does see what's going on. And then just as they walk in, Picard is suddenly unstable, and the doctor said, oh, we have to stabilize his brain or something. And then Rios says, oh, to stabilize. He kind of looks for something, and then he tells Raffi, beam me something to stabilize his brain. And then immediately, in a nanosecond, it appears in his hand. Like Raffi had time in 1 second to beam something for him. Why didn't they beam all the equipment they need right away? Why didn't they beam Picard into the ship, which would make more sense? That way they will not get caught, they will not have to hide from anyone or explain it to anyone. But no, they leave him in the clinic, they start beaming advanced medical equipment there, and then Rios, who is a Starfleet captain, I remind you, doesn't know how to use it, and so he gives it to the 21st century doctor so that she will use the advanced medical device on Picard to cure him. And then she does. She somehow magically knows how to use it. It would have been more clever to actually use that magical device from the previous season. Remember the one that the androids gave them as a gift? How come it was never used since? They could have used it to fix their ship or whatever they needed, because it's a magical device that whatever you imagine happens. And so it would have made more sense in the scene if that device appeared, and then at least it kind of hooks into your brain and it kind of knows what you want to happen. And so maybe in this case it would have made more sense to give it to the doctor who has some more knowledge about biology or whatever, and then her imagination can help fix Picard. So at least that would have made slightly more sense, but no, it's just a normal medical device which Rios doesn't know how to use. Can you imagine if Picard was in some kind of situation when he had to treat someone? I think there were situations like that in TNG, in which different members of the crew did know how to use basic medical devices as well, not just the doctor. So anyway, Rios, who's a Starfleet captain, doesn't know how to use it, so he gives it to a 24th century doctor who never seen such equipment of any kind in her life, and she magically knows how to do it. And the funniest part is that all she had to do was just hold it next to his head. So how come Rios couldn't do it? If all you have to do is hold it next to his head and it's all automatic, so why didn't you do it? And then later he just decides to tell her everything because he has the hots for her. That's the only reason. That's the only reason they stayed in the clinic, so that Rios will be able to do that. Because logically they would simply beam Picard into the ship and shoot him there instead of leaving him in a dangerous spot and endangering the past and the timeline, but they only did it so that Rios will be forced to tell this doctor the truth, and so he tells her that he's not from space, he only works in space, which is a line directly taken from the voyage home. So again, a total lack of originality, and it's not even funny, it's not any kind of twist on that line, it's not any kind of parody of it, it's simply the same exact line, and so just ripping off other works which were better. And then he decides to beam her and her kid into the spaceship to brag about it, to show them, oh look, this is my spaceship and it's all fun and all of that. And so what the hell is going on? Isn't he a Starfleet captain? And Starfleet captains are supposed to uphold the Prime Directive, including the Temporal Prime Directive, even at the cost of their lives. And so what the hell is going on? And meanwhile, inside the dream, Picard is still talking to that therapist, and now Picard says that he didn't know that Starfleet still employs psychologists like him. And I'm like thinking, what the hell do you mean you're not aware of that? Didn't you have a psychologist on your own ship? And then the psychologist tells him to tell him a child's story, and Picard says he doesn't know how to tell stories, and I have flashbacks of that episode Darmok in which he was perfect at telling stories to someone who didn't even understand him, and suddenly now he says he has no idea how to tell stories, and once again being obnoxious and boring, and what the hell is going on here? And then he does agree to tell a story about a queen who was female, which he has to say for some reason. And then we have that scene of him and his mother playing dress up, and little Picard is dressed as a prince, and then he says he doesn't want to be a prince, he wants to be a queen like his mother or something like that. And I don't know, I was half asleep at that point. And then the paintings on the window start moving and they have to run away from monsters or something, and then they go into the tunnels under the house, and now we see that it's a huge maze that looks like a giant castle under the house. So how big is this structure? It looks like an infinite labyrinth of mazes and whatever, and so it's absolutely ridiculous. And now I suddenly realize it's also similar to that movie Pan's Labyrinth, which also had a girl who lived in her imagination, and in the end of the movie she also went into a giant labyrinth maze to hide from the bad guys or something. So it's also similar to that, but done much worse here, because here it's all boring and pointless. And on the way they also meet Freddy Krueger and the clown from It, and then Nat Laris shows up to see all of this from the side, and then she helps save little Picard. but his mom went missing and is hiding somewhere in the maze or something. And then we get to the twist of the episode. So the old Picard and his therapist appear in the same dungeon with the little Picard, and then we hear some banging on a door, which Picard kept hearing all the time, by the way, so that's his mother after she got locked up, and so suddenly it's revealed that therapist is actually Picard's father. So how come Picard doesn't recognize his own father? That's never explained. That is actually how he looked like, apparently. That's the same guy that was in all the flashbacks. So only now he recognizes him as his own father. And then his father looks at him and says, "You lived longer than I did, son, but I never lost my hair." And that part made me facepalm so hard, because once again it proves to me that whoever is making this show never bothered to actually watch TNG, because we actually saw Picard's father in the episode Tapestry, which was also a very good Q episode. So you would think if someone was writing this season which features Q doing a prank on Picard, he would at least watch the episodes with Q. And so in one of those episodes we actually saw Picard's father, and he was bald like him, or almost like him. So how come whoever wrote this line doesn't know that Picard's father was in fact bald? And if you're writing for a multi-million-dollar episode, wouldn't you at least Google it when you write it? Like, if you're writing that line, wouldn't you check it online? You don't even have to watch the episode. Just go online and type in Picard's father, and you will see Google images of that guy from Memory Alpha and all of that. So how lazy are the writers that they don't even bother to do that? At this point, I'm suspecting it's deliberate, that they want to piss us off. All the old Trekkies who actually care about the details and the continuity and all of that, it's as if they're deliberately doing it. Because what was even the point of that line? And that line doesn't even make any sense in the context of Star Trek, because, as I said previously on this channel, the whole issue of Picard's baldness is not really an issue, because Picard himself never talked about it as if it was a problem for him, and I always assumed it was simply a fashion choice, that he wanted to look like that. It's not as if there is no cure for baldness in the future, so why would it be any kind of issue for him? So it's not an issue for him. So putting the line here as if his father is mocking him makes no sense, and it just makes the father look like an asshole. So the father says, "I never went bald like you," even though when we saw his father back in TNG in the episode Tapestry, he was in fact bald. And funny, I made a video on this on my other channel, and some people were defending the show, saying, "Oh, you don't get it because obviously he's younger in this version than the one we saw in TNG, so it's a younger." Yeah, but listen to the dialogue. Hear what he says. He said, "I died younger than you, and I still had my hair." So that implies he still had hair in the day he died. So he never lost his hair, which doesn't fit what we saw back in TNG. So the only way to explain this is by saying, once again, all of this show, this whole universe is in a completely different timeline to the one from TNG. It's not the same Picard, it's not the same house, it's not the same castle. And then the big twist of the episode is that his father was actually not abusive toward his mother, and that his mother was actually crazy. She was imagining monsters chasing her, and his father was simply restraining her and locking her in a room for her own safety and protection. And he simply remembered it wrong, which makes absolutely no sense, because how come they never talked about that since? They never discussed these issues in the family. He never knew the truth until now, and he's not that little of a kid in these scenes to imagine that he simply doesn't remember any of these events. They should have cast a younger child maybe, then it would make sense that he simply doesn't remember any of this completely, and yet it was somewhere in the back of his mind, and maybe when he became a synthetic positronic brain, that's when it all resurfaced. Then it would make slightly more sense, but none of this makes any sense as it's shown in this show. So he had this trauma his whole life of thinking that his father abused his mother, when in fact his mother was nuts and she endangered him, and his father actually saved him, and he locked his mother in her room for her own safety. And they never actually finished showing us that story, which I guess will come in later, that Picard has the key to the door. So I imagine that later on we'll see that he sets her free from the room, and that's when she again runs into that maze, and then she dies there or something, and then it's all Picard's fault, and that's the real trauma, that he actually caused his own mother to die, and that's why he repressed the whole thing, and maybe that's why his family never mentioned it again, as not to blame Picard for it or whatever, and maybe that's the real trauma, which we'll see later, I guess, which again wouldn't fit continuity, because we actually saw his mother as an old lady back in season 1 of TNG. Of course, she's not real in that scene, so you could argue that maybe he's simply imagining her in the age she would be in if she still was alive. I guess it could make sense, except for the fact that we actually saw a photo of her in Picard's album, which we saw in Star Trek Generations, and she looked there exactly as she did in season 1 of TNG, so it's more logical to assume that she never died in a young age. because he does remember her being older. And so no, it wouldn't really fit continuity. It will be once again another proof that this is all in a separate timeline, which is not the same timeline as TNG. So anyway, it's so obvious what happened next that I don't understand why they postponed the revelation of the rest of the story when it's all so obvious, because they show us that he has the key to the door, she's banging on the door asking him to release her, and then they say we'll finish the story some other time. But it's obvious what happened, so he opened the door, his mother again went running into that maze, and they said it's raining or something, so I guess she will get stuck in the maze and drown there, because, you know, in the 24th century, which they're living in this time period, this is not in the distant past, even though it looks like it. It's all happening in the 24th century. So how come the father doesn't call the authorities if she gets lost under the house and they cannot find her? Why doesn't he call the police, and then they will beam in scanners or robots or whatever to find her in the tunnels and beam her out? And so it makes no sense in the context of the bigger story. That's why I say the real life story of this episode makes even less sense than the dream world of the episode, because it makes no sense that she died in the tunnels in the 24th century with all the advanced technology. And how come the father never bothered to actually treat her mental illness? Because I seem to remember back in TOS, Kirk said that humanity found a cure to all mental illness. There was an episode in which they specifically said that, and they showed that there is a cure to any human mental illness. And so how come they never treated Picard's mother's condition, which the father knew about it for a long time apparently? And so anyway, Jean-Luc's mother obviously died because he released her from her room, and so he carries that guilt with him his entire life apparently, because he caused his own mother to die, even though he doesn't seem to remember that, and he seemed to be blaming his father for it, and he had resentment toward his father because he thought his father was abusing his mother. So how come they never once had a conversation about this whole issue in their whole life? It makes absolutely no sense. And what's about Picard's older brother? How come he didn't know any of that? How come he didn't tell Jean-Luc that it wasn't his fault, that his mother was nuts and his father was not abusive? How come no one ever told him that, and just they all allowed him to continue thinking that things went completely differently to how it was? And you know, this could have been written better in a way that would actually fit continuity if they said maybe that was the reason his father and his brother kind of resented Jean-Luc, maybe because they kind of subconsciously blamed him for it because he wasn't responsible enough. Maybe his father told him not to open the door, and then he did open the door, and then the bad thing happened, and so they blamed him. Maybe that could explain that line by Picard's brother in the episode Family when he said, "You broke every rule our father made and got away with it," and he said it with such anger. So it would make sense if maybe because Picard broke the rules, that caused the death of his mother, which was also the mother of his brother, and that's why his brother kind of hated him, even though it would still kind of contradict that episode in which it was obviously that he disliked him simply because he was jealous of him, because Picard, meaning Jean-Luc, was so successful all the time that his bigger brother was simply jealous. But maybe they could have added this little story that maybe their mother died because of Jean-Luc, and maybe his brother, his older brother, was angry at him because of that. That could have added some depth to all of this, and so I'm not necessarily against adding such a backstory. It's simply done in a lazy way that doesn't make any sense, and that's the problem with it. Meanwhile, we see Raffi and Seven back on the ship, and the ship is not cloaked again. So previously the cloak was not very effective, but at least there was some hint of it being cloaked, and now it's not even cloaked anymore at all, so they don't care, even though just an episode ago a policeman showed up and entered the ship, and no backup showed up. So how come they don't assume someone might come searching for whatever happened there previously? And so the ship is not even cloaked anymore. They don't even bother with the special effect of the cloak. And then they discover that Jurati was possessed by the bored queen, and they're now going to look for her in the city. And we saw what Jurati did in the city. She was going into some bar, and I remember I saw that in the teasers, and I thought it's going to be like a Terminator scene of her beating up everyone in that bar. But instead she just comes to a window and bangs on the window until it breaks, and that was the whole scene basically. So she simply had to give herself an endorphin rush to better assimilate Jurati, even though previously we saw that she already fully assimilated Jurati, and yet for some reason she still needs even more endorphins. So how come she didn't simply go and get herself some drugs or whatever to give herself as many endorphins as she wants? No, instead she has to walk around the city looking for fun things to do, and breaking windows is really fun, I guess. Why not have sex with someone in the bar or something like that? That would be more enjoyable to watch, maybe, I don't know. So anyway, Raffi and Seven search for Jurati because Jurati might now start to assimilate the whole city. And so only now they finally say, oh, what the hell did we do bringing a Borg queen into the ancient Earth and all of that? Isn't that kind of dangerous? Yeah, you should have thought about that earlier. I said earlier, how come you didn't even leave anyone to guard the queen? You left her alone on the ship with access to the computer, without any force field around her or anything. So now you're regretting it. Now you're saying, oh, what the hell did we do bringing a Borg queen to ancient Earth before humanity can protect itself? And then Picard wakes up from his coma after learning the truth about his father, that his father wasn't as bad as he thought. And by the way, I remember Patrick Stewart actually revealed this spoiler in one of his interviews. He did say that Picard may be not remembering things correctly and something, and I assumed it's going to be something more clever. I assumed maybe he's actually remembering the other evil timeline of the evil General Picard and his childhood, and maybe that's the cause of the continuity mess. So maybe his memories are not fully his own or something, and so it apparently is even stupider than that, and apparently he just repressed his memories and just thought his entire life that his father was abusive toward his mother, when actually he wasn't. Actually his mother was nuts, and no one ever told him that since. And so I guess that finally answers that question. So now he wakes up and now wants to find Q. He says, we have to go on the offensive against Q. Q keeps trying to analyze me, so now I will analyze him, so let's summon Q. And then Nat Laris suddenly reveals that she actually is Laris, or rather a Romulan. So previously she denied it. Previously when Picard says that he thought she must be an ancestor of Laris, but she said, I don't know what you're talking about. And suddenly it's revealed that she is actually a Romulan, and she's hiding her Romulan ear with some kind of magical device. And then she says because she turned it off, she can only activate it again in 8 hours. What kind of a lame device is that, when she was sent by a species which is 1,000 light years away and they're able to beam people to Earth and they have all this advanced technology, but she can only activate this device in another 8 hours because she turned it off and it cannot be activated again. So now she has to hide her Romulan ear with her hair. And I guess they had to write that in because of something that will happen in the next episode. I will make my prediction shortly. So now we know that she is actually a Romulan, which somehow is supposed to explain something. So is she just an ancestor of Laris? So in the logic of the show, your ancestors always look exactly like you. I guess that explains Sung as well. I guess that we will never see Sung actually making clones of himself. Their explanation in the show is simply that your ancestors from centuries ago look exactly like you. That's their explanation, that's the logic. And I know that many shows do that kind of idea. Even back in TNG we had the Scylla who looked just like her mother Tasha, but you know, that was just one generation, so I could kind of buy that. But now we're talking about centuries, multiple generations, and yet people still looking exactly the same, so that's absolutely ridiculous. With Sung, I'm hoping they will say he was simply cloning himself for generations. That would make much more sense. And yet with Laris, they just say that this woman is her ancestor, which is absolutely ridiculous. It would have been so much more clever to simply say that because of the genetic modifications that the species of the Watchers did to her, it makes her aging much slower, and she will simply live till the 24th century, and then she will decide to simply protect Picard, because that's her duty. Protecting important individuals for the destiny of the galaxy or whatever. That's what she said her job is. So it will make simple sense to say that she's actually the same person. That it's her in the past here, and she will simply live on, because, you know, back in TOS they said that Gary Seven's body was modified to be much more superior to normal human, so it makes sense that the aging process would also be slowed down. So they can simply say in this show that Laris lived on till the 21st century, and then she was assigned to protect Picard for whatever reason. That will make so much more sense than saying she's her ancestor, but the show will not do that, I'm guessing. And then they discuss what to do next, and they say we have to go on the offensive against Q, we have to summon Q. And then he says, I know who can do that, Guinan. And then he once again goes to Guinan's bar. And then we have the most ridiculous scene I've ever seen in my life, when she pulls out a Genie Bottle and she says she can wish a Q to appear. Because her species were once in a cold war with the Q Continuum, and they had a truce, and they signed a truce over a bottle, and one of the agreements of the truce, I guess, is if she drinks from that bottle and makes some noises, it will summon a Q. And then she does that. She opens the bottle, she shakes it, she drinks from it, and then she starts making strange noises or whatever, and then the whole room is shaking, all the lights are flickering, chairs are flying all over the place, and so something fantastical is happening, right? And then nothing happens. No Q shows up. And so, what was even the point of that scene? I guess it was to explain that mysterious bit of dialogue between Q and Guinan back in Q Who, when Q said that he had some dealings with Guinan 2 centuries ago. Not 4 centuries, 2 centuries ago. And yet apparently she knew of him back from the 21st century, and that her entire species were at war with the Q somehow, even though her species are not nearly as powerful as Q. So what the hell does that even mean? How could they have been in a war with the Q continuum? Makes absolutely no sense. I know they're long-lived and can see alternate timelines, but that's basically it. They didn't have any superpowers until this show established that they can also change faces apparently and look older or younger if they want to. Too bad Soren didn't do that to hide his identity back in Generations, or that guy that showed up in Deep Space Nine who was a con man, he never bothered to change his face, and so none of this makes any sense. So Guinan has the bottle which her entire species signed the truce with the Q over, but her personally, she has that one bottle with the magical genie ability to summon a Q, her specifically. What a coincidence, how convenient is that? And then she uses it and then nothing happens. So if nothing happens, what exactly caused that chaos in the bar to happen with all the bottles exploding and all of that if it didn't work? So it makes no sense. Either it did work or it didn't. How can it release all this energy and then nothing happens? It's all so stupid. The faces she makes are hilarious. And then some guy shows up at the bar and then they think, is that a Q? And then she kind of raises her hands in exactly the same way as Guinan did in the episode Q Who. And so I thought, oh, so they did watch that episode. So it obviously is an attempt to explain that scene, that they had some history together or something. So obviously they are aware of the background from TNG, and I'm totally fine with them trying to explain it, but their explanation is ridiculous. They should have explained it better, that's all. They could have said, some other Q made an alliance with my species and gave us this power and gave me this bottle, and that's why Q was afraid of me back in Q Who and whatever. So they could have explained it better, but they did it in such a stupid, crazy, lame way that I don't buy it, and it's just ridiculous. So she has a magical genie bottle which was lying around in the bar, and yet no one ever took it, no one ever drank from it, but it can summon the most powerful being in the whole universe, and she just kept it in her normal bar. And now she opens it and drinks it and makes some noises, and it causes chaos in the bar and bottles exploding and lights go off, and then nothing happens. And then some other guy does show up, and then she raises her hands and says, no, that's not a Q. And so they ignore that guy who wants to get a drink, and they keep talking in front of him about the Q things and all of that. And I kept thinking, are they seriously not considering even the possibility that maybe he actually is a Q or something? Because what a coincidence that he showed up at this exact moment, and yet they don't seem to think that. And then he starts kind of investigating them. He implies that he knows something science fiction is going on, and so obviously he's not just some regular guy from the street. He's actually someone who knows something, and so it's not here for no reason. So obviously something interesting is going to happen. And what I kept thinking about is temporal agents from the future should really pay a visit to Picard and his crew and to arrest all of them for the chaos they're making in the 21st century. And then he starts talking with them about science fiction and all of that. And then he shows them a video he has of Picard beaming in next to that place, which is something that I mentioned previously, that they openly beam in and out of the city in front of people, and they don't seem to be worried about someone seeing that and all of that, which was ridiculous. So it's obviously some kind of an investigator, and so I kept thinking this must be a temporal agent from the future. And I didn't know while I was watching the episode. I found out later that this is actually the same guy who played a temporal agent back in the Voyager episode Relativity. He was an officer on the time ship Relativity, and when I realized that, I was very happy, because I thought, oh, so it is a temporal agent, so it will actually be much more interesting later on, and it's a nice tie into Voyager. But apparently it's all just a coincidence, because I just watched the preview for the next episode, and apparently this guy is just a normal cop from this century who just saw some Vulcans when he was a kid. And ever since then, he was obsessed with aliens and all of that, and that's why he's so obsessed and wants to get Picard or whatever, and he's not a temporal agent. So what a missed opportunity, what a waste not to tie it with that guy from Voyager, because that would actually be interesting. Why wouldn't temporal agents come to investigate after all the mess that Seven and Raffi and Rios did to the timeline? It would make perfect sense for time agents to show up to stop them and the mess they're causing. And so having the same actor already, you have him anyway, so why not make him a temporal agent? Instead, he's just some guy who saw Vulcans when he was a kid, because apparently Vulcans visited Earth yet again. We had that incident we saw in Enterprise with T'Pol's grandmother being on Earth. I guess maybe it's the same event, I don't know. So apparently this kid saw some Vulcans beaming off Earth in the past, and ever since then he was determined to find out about aliens or whatever, and now that he saw a footage of Picard beaming in, that's why he called the police, and he arrests Picard and Guinan, and Picard immediately throws his communicator to the floor, which is kind of stupid because wouldn't they search the place after arresting them anyway? So I don't know. So they take them away, and that's the end of the episode. And so what a ridiculous show. What a bunch of nonsense. And the most annoying is the missed opportunity, because having the same guy who played a temporal agent in an episode of Voyager in the same franchise, having the same actor appear here and not have him be a temporal agent, that's just such a huge missed opportunity. You know, having the temporal agents from the future would make so much sense to explain, for example, how come the Q lost his power. Maybe the temporal agents from the distant future found ways to counteract the Q's ability or whatever. Maybe they went back in time to also try to stop whatever Q was doing, and so maybe they were the one limiting his powers. And so obviously it's not going to be the explanation. It will probably be something much more stupid. Maybe all the Q simply got some kind of virus and they're all dying away. That's why Guinan's Shurik didn't work, even though if it didn't work, why did it cause the whole room to shake? So anyway, nothing in the show makes any sense at all. It's really annoying to me, and that's all I had to say about that.